So I work predominantly on far-right extremism, white supremacist extremism, and school-based responses or educational responses and the needs of parents, teachers, and school authorities in trying to understand how to combat rising far-right extremism. And so under the current pandemic, actually, my group of researchers has been even busier because far-right groups globally have been exploiting the COVID-19 pandemic to mobilize, to enact conspiracy theories, to spread misinformation and disinformation about the virus and its origins and the government's response. Some xenophobic hate attacks on Asians and Asian Americans, for example, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And so one of the things that we've done is developed a parents and caregivers guide. Parents are the teachers right now, so it's a guide for people who are living at home with the tens of millions of young people who are also learning entirely online, to help them better recognize signs of radicalization, warning signs, and some sense of what to do about it. We are also working on with a German foundation on an animated video to help people understand some of the misinformation and disinformation that's circulating about COVID-19 and some of the anti-government extremist responses, as well as some collaboration with folks in Germany who are working on the conspiracies themselves and the public educational needs. So there's a whole range of needs as you relate the current circumstance of COVID-19 to extremist group mobilization and the kinds of educational response that's needed. This virus has really laid bare how gross the inequities are in the US healthcare system in ways that, were already obvious to millions and millions of people who are uninsured or had generations of poor health outcomes because of the inequalities in healthcare provision. But seeing the differential rate of mortality and the way that the virus is impacting African American and other minority groups differently than others, I think has to force that kind of change here. And I think that we are seeing some kinds of similar parallels in other parts of the world where you see, what is the impact going to be in refugee camps, or how is it going to be exacerbated by other patterns of inequality? And so I think when you're looking at a virus like this that is differentially impacting people who already have, are already in unequal situations, that must raise consciousness about some of the structural changes that are needed. So on the one hand, I think that's a change that I hope will come out of this, and that I think is already starting to happen in some of the rage and pain and anguish we're seeing in the protests right now that are, obviously about police brutality, but also rooted in other kinds of social injustice. And so I would say that's one major change. Another major change, I think, is that it's just increasingly obvious that these are not national problems, but that, like a pandemic, is truly global. I think that extremist groups are using this moment opportunistically, and I think that we have to respond both opportunistically and strategically. So we have to be responsive to that, and part of that means the strategic part of that, I think, is cross-national collaboration, just the way that we have cross-national collaboration about the virus and the public health response to it, and how we can develop a vaccine, let's say. We also need that on the education side and on the public education side, because extremist groups are already collaborating and sharing memes and conspiracy theories and misinformation across borders. I think it's critical to face these problems with a global approach, and I also think it's a critical moment for scientists, for social scientists, and for civil society to forge those connections, because it's clear we can't always rely on our governments to do that. I mean, we have governments that are retreating into nationalism as a result of COVID-19, and, closing borders that are, in some ways obviously necessary to protect public health of people, at least temporarily, but in other ways really not related to the virus itself, but to kind of a xenophobic response to the virus. And I think it just shows how important it is to have parallel tracks of global cooperation that are not only reliant on the government itself, but that can use civil society and private foundations and exchange of social scientists and scientists to continue to forge those links when governments fail to do so.